A key takeaway from last week's news cycle is that Democrats have to abide by norms and play by the rules, whereas Republicans don't. You see, red states like Texas, Florida, Tennessee, Missouri, North Carolina, and others, they can gerrymander black voters out of existence like that. But in order for blue states like California and Virginia to gerrymander themselves, they first have to clear multiple procedural hurdles and put it up to a vote. And even then, that still might not stand because, as we all saw, Virginia's Supreme Court struck down their state's map that was just approved by voters. And that was in the same week, mind you, that the Supreme Court gave red states the power to delete black districts out of existence. In fact, Virginia's Supreme Court issued that ruling the day after Tennessee lawmakers decimated their state's only black district, and white supremacist lawmakers in Tennessee were basically rubbing it in the faces of their black constituents. Two of them were seen laughing at people who showed up to protest the revival of Jim Crow, and another was parading around with a MAGA flag in front of them, presumably because he left his Klanhood at home. And you also see Republican Scott Cepicky try to laugh about this with Representative Tory Harris, a Democrat, as if his black colleague would find their behavior amusing or something. But if that wasn't bad enough, Scott Cepicky had the audacity to retweet someone bemoaning the behavior of his Democratic colleagues for their supposed uncouth behavior. And the message couldn't be more clear. Republican Confederates get to crush us, and we have to just sit back and take it. In fact, after Virginia's state Supreme Court struck down its voter-approved map, the official Twitter account for Republicans shared a picture of Donald Trump flipping us the bird. And by the way, that was actually Donald Trump's response to a worker calling him a pedophile protector. Nonetheless, it adequately conveyed their feelings to the other half of the country. Fuck you. We get what we want, and you don't. And that was basically the response collectively from Republicans. They were gloating about this. They were hypocritically also chastising Democrats for trying to gerrymander in Virginia, even though they know that it was Trump who started this race to the bottom in the first place. But it doesn't matter to them. Winning isn't enough. They've got to go the extra step to spit in our fucking faces, too. And while they were scolding Democrats for their undemocratic behavior in Virginia, Confederate states such as Mississippi, Alabama, and South Carolina were cooking up their own plans to disenfranchise every last black voter in their states, thanks to the new SCOTUS decision. And with regard to Alabama in particular, the U.S. Supreme Court itself actually just gave them the go-ahead to implement their new racist map before this year's election, even though their primary already began, which means that they're definitely going to be following in the footsteps of Louisiana. Their governor actually declared a state of emergency and canceled their election, even though 45,000 people had already cast their ballots. And their governor's reaction was basically, tough shit.
More than 45,000 ballots have been returned. What happens to those?
Oh, those ballots are discarded, and those voters will vote again in November.
You say that like it's not a big deal.
Well, it's not a big deal. It's not my fault. Go, if anybody has a grievance, take it to the United States Supreme Court.
Right. It's not his fault. He has no choice but to comply with the Supreme Court. You know, it's not like Republicans would ever defy the Supreme Court or anything. They'd never do that. The Supreme Court ruled that black people can't have equal representation because that would be tantamount to discrimination against white people. So Republicans have no choice but to comply, so that way white people have a chance in this country for the first time ever, perhaps. But it's actually worse than that, according to them, because as Louisiana's racist governor put it,
in the United States, we get equal rights. No one gets extra rights.
Right. So equal rights means extra rights in the minds of inbred Confederates. And to even object to the revival of Jim Crow-era voting maps is nothing more than disingenuous identity politics. In fact, Tennessee lawmaker Tim Burchett, whose parents are probably cousins, condemned Democrats for playing the race card.
And that's all the Democrats really have left in their big deck of cards is the race card. They divide folks up and fear in their hearts, and that's exactly what they're doing with this. And it's, as I said, it's very disingenuous.
Yeah, I mean, how dare Democrats point out the role that race plays, especially in southern states that still fly treasonous Confederate flags and honor Confederate traitors with statues and monuments. It's just disingenuous to point that out, right? But it's apparently not disingenuous to purge the federal government of black workers under the guise of improving government efficiency. That's what his party did with Doge. They also cut off federal grants to black researchers and women under the guise of fighting discrimination in the form of DEI. Turns out That was a little disingenuous too, seeing as how a federal judge determined that Doge, quote, blatantly used race, gender, and other protected characteristics to execute the largest mass termination of federal grants in the history of the National Endowment for Humanities. But you see, you can't bring up race, otherwise you're doing identity politics. It's not that we're pointing out that they're the ones engaging in white identity politics. It's that we're woke SJWs that want to make everything about race because that's the only card that we have left to play, since they're the ones with all the good policy ideas after all. You know, like cutting more tax cuts for the rich and deregulating fossil fuel companies so that way they can continue to pollute the only planet that we can live on. They're always right no matter what, and we're always wrong. Not because that's true, but because if they're not allowed to steamroll us and have a disproportionate say in our politics, then it's not fair to them. That's the message from Republicans to the rest of the country after last week. We have to follow the rules, and they don't. They get to destroy us, and we have to shut the fuck up and take it. And we have no choice but to let them crush us and Nazify the country and turn it into a fucking Christian nationalist theocracy. Otherwise, they might throw temper tantrums or rise up and try to overthrow the U.S. government again. Well, I say fuck them. Fuck them all. Enough is enough. I am so tired of this double standard. I'm tired of letting the worst, most racist, regressive, inbred pieces of fucking shit dictate the terms of our goddamn country. And the Virginia State Supreme Court, that decision really felt like the last straw because it was basically the system's last fuck you to the rest of us. It felt like the final nail in the coffin of our entire country, where they're almost explicitly sentencing us to perpetual one-party rule, and there's nothing that we can do about it. But I, for one, say we shouldn't just sit back and take it. I don't think that we should just accept that we're destined to be ruled by a fascist authoritarian death cult. If democracy is dead and politics is nothing more than a raw power struggle at this point, then we actually need to get power by fighting fire with fire. So that's why my immediate reaction to the Virginia Supreme Court ruling was for Virginia Democrats to just ignore it, say fuck it, and just proceed ahead as they were planning to. But there are some Democrats who actually have different plans that would yield the same results, which I'm here for. The New York Times reports that Hakeem Jeffries held a call with Virginia state lawmakers to talk about what to do going forward, and even though nothing is concrete, they floated some ideas that are downright brilliant. One would be to lower the mandatory retirement age of Virginia Supreme Court justices from 75 down to 54, which would force all of them to retire, thus allowing them to appoint new Democratic justices. Another option would be to, quote, invoke a January ruling by a circuit court judge in Tazewell County, Virginia, that said the 2026 constitutional amendment effort to redraw the maps was invalid because county officials did not post notice of it at courthouses and other public locations 3 months before a general election. Democrats would aim to use that ruling to seek to invalidate the earlier constitutional amendment that created the state's independent redistricting commission by arguing that courthouses across the state did not post notice of it at the time. That would give the legislature the authority to enact a map of its choosing. And to that I say, hell yeah. Now we are cooking with grease, Democrats. They are finally starting to think like Republicans, and not in the policy way, but in the strategic sense. This is what you have to do to compete in this new authoritarian environment. The problem, however, is that some Democrats are already getting cold feet about the prospect of fighting back because, of course, there was a quote from a former lawmaker from Virginia in this article, James P. Moran, who told the New York Times that we shouldn't do this because it would be a bridge too far and it would backfire for the party. Also, aside from that, the House Speaker immediately came out and said that he would respect the decision of his state Supreme Court. And Virginia's governor, Abigail Spanberger, responded by basically telling people to vote harder, even though they just did that and it didn't work. And to add insult to injury, the state Senate Majority Leader actually responded to specific solutions proposed in this article and basically said, yeah, there's no way that's happening. Journalist Brandon Jarvis reports, Senate Majority Leader Scott Serval tells me that the rumors yesterday that Democrats are considering drastic measures to implement new maps are not going anywhere. They would not have time under the current system used at the Department of Elections to make the changes, he says. He also says forcing the retirement of Supreme Court justices would be extreme, and he wants to work within the current legal system to do these kinds of things. But therein lies the problem. You're working within the current legal system while Republicans are not. You're constraining yourself to rules of a game that Republicans are no longer playing. They flipped over the board while Democrats are still waiting patiently for their turn. You have to adapt or you will die. Do you not understand this? Your party is going to go extinct if you don't adapt. It really is that serious. Some Democrats are finally starting to get this, but too many of them still don't understand that the old days are gone. Democracy is fucking dead, and we're in a fight for survival at this point. I understand that it's hard to accept this new reality because none of us wanted this. We didn't. This is a race to the bottom, and we all hate to see it. I don't like this. We all supported a nationwide ban on gerrymandering, but guess what? Republicans rejected that because they knew enhancing democracy wouldn't serve in their interests. They couldn't get power in a democratic system, so they decided to operate outside of the bounds of democracy. We have to acknowledge that is the situation, and we have to adapt. If we don't adapt, we die. If we're not at least equally as ruthless as they are, then we are going to be forced to live in the Confederate States of America for the foreseeable future. It's that simple. It really is that bleak. And just ask yourself, how would Republicans react if their state Supreme Court did something like the Virginia Supreme Court did when they were in control? So you don't have to guess because we know the answer. They would defy their court without hesitation. Wouldn't even be a consideration for them at all. The new maps drawn in Florida by Ron DeSantis openly defy an amendment to their state's constitution that was adopted by 60% of voters in 2010. Ron DeSantis didn't have to clear a bunch of procedural hurdles or put these new maps up to a vote like Abigail Spanberger and Gavin Newsom did. And he sure as shit wouldn't respect a ruling from a state Supreme Court if they said that this new map is illegal. Why? Because Republicans don't play by the rules. In Ohio, their state Supreme Court actually did strike down their gerrymandered map too. And do you want to know how they responded when Republicans were in control? They still are, by the way, thanks to this story. But do you want to know what they did? They ignored the court. Again and again and again. In a write-up for the Cleveland Metro Bar Association, Stephen Steinglass explains, in 2022, the Ohio Supreme Court ruled 5 times that the state's redistricting maps proposed by the Ohio Redistricting Commission violated the Ohio Constitution. These rulings should have resolved the issue. Instead, they were defied. Empowered by a surprising intervention from a 3-judge federal district court, the commission ignored each decision. As a result, since 2022, Ohioans have voted in state legislative districts warped by unconstitutional partisan gerrymandering. This wasn't just a bureaucratic misstep, it was a direct rejection of constitutional accountability. What makes this episode particularly troubling is that 4 lawyers, including the governor and a former justice of the Ohio Supreme Court, were among those who supported the unlawful maps. Their priority, it seems, was maintaining political power even at the expense of legal and democratic norms. And keep in mind, 70% of voters adopted a state constitutional amendment to ban partisan gerrymandering, and even though their state Supreme Court told them 5 times that their district violated their own state's constitution, state Republicans responded every single time by telling them to fuck right off. And those unconstitutional maps are still in effect today. Why? Because Republicans don't have to play by the rules. Those rules are for Democrats and Democrats only. And in the state of Utah, its state Supreme Court actually has been a real pain in the ass for Republicans. They not only blocked their partisan gerrymander, they also blocked their near-total abortion ban, they blocked their anti-trans school sports ban, they even blocked an attempt to privatize public education with a bullshit school voucher program. But do you want to know how Republicans responded to their Supreme Court blocking what they tried to implement? They packed the cord because, of course, they did. The Salt Lake Tribune reports that Governor Spencer Cox of Utah signed legislation approved by their GOP-controlled legislature to add 2 additional seats to their state Supreme Court, making it so that way 5 of the 7 justices were appointed by the governor himself. And they did this because, say it with me, Republicans don't play by the rules. They're not a constraint to Republicans, ever. They either change the rules in their favor or they just disregard them entirely. Because we no longer live in a democratic system. We live in a nakedly authoritarian regime. It's competitive authoritarianism, but authoritarianism nonetheless. But even some dictators aren't as brazen as Republicans. Most dictators wouldn't just cancel elections like the Louisiana governor did because even they know that that would cause an uproar, which they don't want. But Republicans don't give a shit. They couldn't care less. And before most dictators announce that they're just going to stay in power for life, they usually try to legitimize that move with some sort of bogus constitutional amendment rubber-stamped by the legislature and approved by courts. But Republicans in Ohio were like, fuck it. We don't care what the Constitution says. We don't care what voters said. We're not even going to bother to change it. We're just going to give ourselves the power to stay in office indefinitely, whether voters like it or not. And it pains me to basically offer more authoritarianism as a solution. It's not really a solution. It's just the survival thing we have to do. But again, we have no choice. I wanted none of this. 10 years ago, I wouldn't even entertain letting Democrats do something like this. I would be against it because I've always supported democratic norms and principles, still do. But it doesn't matter what I want. It doesn't matter what you want. It doesn't matter what any of us want. We have to play the cards that we've been dealt. America is essentially a competitive authoritarian regime for all intents and purposes. And I think that it would behoove us all to not let the fascist confederates have all of the power in our declining system. If a party that poses an existential threat to all life on Earth is not playing by the rules, then I think that we have a moral obligation to also not play by the rules. Democrats have a responsibility, even I'd argue, to match their energy and be as ruthless to them as they are to us. That means we have to do things that we don't want to do. It means you have to ignore rulings that benefit them. And it also means you have to work overtime to disenfranchise every single Republican voter that you can. If you're a blue state with a couple of red districts that you can't gerrymander away, guess what? Maybe you're going to have to limit the number of polling stations in those precincts. Sucks, but that's the reality. If you, live in a blue state with some Republican districts, maybe you change the polling places at the last minute and you not tell anybody where the new locations are. Sounds gross, but nothing I'm saying is unprecedented, by the way. I'm simply saying Democrats should treat Republicans the way that they've treated black voters forever. If they're going to suppress black votes, then you respond in kind by suppressing Republican votes. Sorry, hillbillies, you didn't update your registration immediately after you moved? Well, you're getting cleansed from the voting rolls. So sorry. You go tit for tat and you match every single thing that they do because we can't afford not to. And listen, I would love to get to a place where one day we can actually restore democracy and put an end to gerrymandering once and for all at the national level. I'd also love to take steps to depoliticize the Supreme Court somehow, but that's not going to happen. That'll never come to fruition if we act like small d Democrats while they act like fucking authoritarian tyrants. And I'll fully admit, it's a bit of an oxymoron to suggest that restoring democracy necessitates that Democrats be as autocratic as Republicans are, because autocrats aren't going to willingly just give up power once they get it. So I'm fully aware that there is a real cost to everything that I'm saying, but we're very clearly going down the path of authoritarianism, whether I want to or not. And I'm sorry, but in a power struggle between two warring sides, I want to do everything in my power to make sure that the Confederate fascist theocratic side loses. I'm sorry. I don't want them to have the power in this environment, because when our entire country inevitably collapses, I think that we're going to be in a better position to build something better if the bad people who want us dead have less of a say. So, in conclusion, this country is very clearly headed in one direction, and once Republicans solidify their grip on power, there truly is no coming back from that. And if Democrats don't even bother to try to stop that from happening while they still can, then we truly are doomed. That is, if our fate hasn't already been sealed.